I ruined my life with one mistake. I slept with my stepmother. I hope you're ready for this story. I've been betrayed twice. You'll realize that at the end of the story. Moving back into my dad's house at 24 felt like swallowing a jagged pill. 1 month turned into 3, then 6, and I was still stuck there, marinating in my own failure. My college dropout status and sporadic delivery gigs weren't exactly resume gold. But the real kick in the teeth wasn't my dad's thinly veiled disappointment. It was her. Vanessa, Dad's second wife. The one who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine ad for expensive perfume. She was 34, barely 10 years older than me, with a laugh like tinkling glass and this way of looking at you like she could see through your skin. Dad had met her at some charity gala when she was waitressing, and now she was Mrs. Robert Hayward, living in our sprawling suburban mansion and driving a Lexus she didn't even know how to parallel park. Our first encounter when I moved back wasn't what you'd call warm. She'd extended a perfectly manicured hand and said, "You must be Jason," her voice dripping with honey. I'd grunted something like, "Yeah, nice to meet you." She smiled, but her eyes scanned me, measuring, calculating. It wasn't just polite curiosity. It was something else, something that made the back of my neck prickle. Living with Vanessa and my dad was weird. Not because she did anything overtly wrong, but because there was this charged undercurrent every time we were in the same room. Like the time I caught her doing yoga in the living room, her toned body moving fluidly in leggings that might as well have been painted on. She didn't even flinch when she saw me gawking, just smirked and said, "Yoga's all about focus, Jason. Want to join?" I mumbled an excuse and fled to my room, my face burning. Dad was busy most of the time. Robert Hayward, CEO of Hayward Tech. He was always on a conference call, always out networking or flying to some corporate retreat. His absence was practically the soundtrack of my childhood. Now it just left me alone in the house with Vanessa. First, we barely interacted. But slowly, she started bridging the gap. Offering to make me coffee in the mornings. Asking about my job search, her tone sympathetic. Complimenting me on mundane things, like the shirt I was wearing or how I'd fixed the broken garage door opener. "Robert never gets his hands dirty," she said one evening, handing me a beer. "It's nice having someone around who does." I laughed nervously. "Yeah, well, it's no big deal." Her eyes lingered on me for a second too long before she smiled and walked away. By the 3rd month, the air between us felt like a stretched rubber band, ready to snap. The tension wasn't just in my head. I'd catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression unreadable. Once, I walked into the kitchen shirtless after a shower, and she froze mid-sip of her wine, her gaze trailing over my chest before she quickly looked away. Then there was the time Dad announced he'd be gone for a week on a business trip to Chicago. Vanessa played the dutiful wife, kissing him goodbye at the door and waving as his car disappeared down the driveway. That night, it was just the two of us in the house. "Want a drink?" she asked, holding up a bottle of wine. Sure," I said, sitting on the couch. She poured 2 glasses and handed me one before sinking into the armchair opposite me. She was wearing these silky pajamas, the kind that looked more decorative than functional. The neckline dipped low, and I was doing everything in my power not to stare. "So," she said, swirling her wine, "how's the job hunt?" I shrugged. "Same. No bites." She sighed dramatically. "Men like you shouldn't have to work so hard to prove themselves." That made me laugh. "Men like me." She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her wine glass dangling from her fingers. "You're smart, capable, good-looking. Don't tell me you don't know that." I felt my pulse quicken. Thanks, I guess." She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something darker, something dangerous. We ended up drinking more than we should have. The wine disappeared, then the bottle of whiskey I'd stashed in the pantry. At some point, the conversation shifted from light banter to something more personal. "You know," she said, her voice a little slurred, "Robert's not as perfect as he seems." I snorted. "Yeah, I figured that out a long time ago." She tilted her head, studying me. "You're not like him, though. You're different." "Different how?" I asked, my heart pounding. Her gaze locked on mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. You actually feel things. The moment it happened, I knew it was a mistake. A monumental, earth-shattering mistake. She kissed me first. 1 second, we were sitting there, and the next, she was leaning in, her lips brushing mine. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, done something to stop it. But I didn't. By the time I stumbled back to my room hours later, my head was spinning. Not from the alcohol, but from what we'd just done. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, guilt and shame crashing over me in waves. But underneath it all, there was something else. Something I wasn't ready to admit. Excitement. When I woke up the next morning, my stomach twisted into knots. I tried telling myself it was the whiskey, that I'd drunk too much, that my body was protesting. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't the alcohol. It was what I'd done. Vanessa. Her name alone was enough to make my heart race. Flashes of the night before kept surfacing no matter how hard I tried to shove them down. The way her hands had traced my chest, the taste of her lips, the sound of her breathless whispers. I groaned, covering my face with my hands. What the hell had I been thinking? I avoided her for most of the day, staying in my room under the guise of a killer hangover. Around noon, I heard her soft knock on the door. "Jason?" she called, her voice light, as if nothing had happened. I froze. "You okay?" she asked after a pause. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, my voice muffled by the pillow. She didn't push it, thank God. I heard her footsteps retreating down the hall, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But the reprieve didn't last. That evening, I came downstairs to grab something to eat, my plan being to dash in and out before she could corner me. But she was already there, leaning against the kitchen counter with a glass of wine in her hand. She smiled when she saw me, and my stomach did a nervous flip. "Feeling better?" "Yeah," I said quickly, opening the fridge and pretending to be very interested in its contents. "Jason." Her tone was soft, almost pleading. I shut the fridge door but didn't turn around. "About last night," she began. I spun around to face her, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "It was a mistake. We shouldn't have." "Do you regret it?" she interrupted, her eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Did I regret it? Yes. No. Maybe. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent against the tiled floor. "Because I don't." I should have said something, anything, to stop her. But when she reached out and touched my arm, my resolve crumbled. "Vanessa, we can't," I said weakly, though my body betrayed me by leaning into her touch. "Why not?" she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "Robert's barely here. He doesn't care about me. Not really. But you?" She trailed off, her hands sliding down my arm. I felt like I was drowning, caught between what I knew was right and the magnetic pull of her presence. "He's my dad," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "And I'm your stepmother," she said with a bitter laugh. "Doesn't exactly make me family, does it?" Her words hit a nerve, and before I could think better of it, I kissed her. It became a pattern. Whenever Dad was out of the house, which was often, Vanessa and I found ways to be alone together. A stolen kiss in the kitchen, whispered conversations in the dark, nights spent tangled in sheets, our guilt forgotten in the heat of the moment. It was reckless and stupid, and every time I told myself it would be the last. But then she'd smile at me, or brush her fingers against mine, and I'd fall right back into it. One night, we were sitting on the couch watching a movie while Dad was at some networking event. I was hyper-aware of her beside me, her leg brushing against mine, her perfume filling the air between us. "This is torture," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. She glanced at me, her lips curving into a sly smile. "What is?" "You, sitting there, acting like nothing's going on." She leaned in closer, her voice a teasing whisper. "What do you suggest we do about it?" I didn't need any more encouragement. The affair wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She told me things she'd never told Dad, about her childhood, her dreams, her fears, and I listened, offering her the attention and understanding she said she'd been missing. But the closer we got, the more paranoid I became. One afternoon, as we were lying in bed, I turned to her and said, "What if he finds out?" She propped herself up on one elbow, her expression calm. "He won't. But what if he does?" I pressed. "He'll kill me. And you." She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. "Jason, relax. Robert doesn't pay enough attention to notice anything." Her words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't. If anything, they made me feel worse. The paranoia only grew from there. Every time Dad looked at me for a second too long, I was convinced he knew. Every time Vanessa and I were in the same room with him, I felt like we were walking a tightrope. I started avoiding him altogether, using any excuse I could to stay out of his way. Vanessa, on the other hand, acted like nothing had changed. It was infuriating and terrifying. The breaking point came one night when Dad came home earlier than expected. Vanessa and I were in the living room, sitting a little too close, her hand casually resting on my thigh. The sound of the front door opening made us jump apart like guilty kids caught raiding the cookie jar. Dad walked in, his gaze sweeping over us. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes made my stomach drop. He knew something was off. From that night forward, I could feel Dad's eyes on me like a spotlight. Subtle changes in his behavior amplified my paranoia. He'd linger longer in the living room after work or pause in conversation, as if waiting for me to slip up. Vanessa seemed unbothered, going about her day as if nothing had happened. She still laughed at his jokes during dinner and kissed him on the cheek when he left for work, playing her role perfectly. I wasn't as good at pretending. "Everything okay, son?" Dad asked one morning over breakfast. I flinched at his question, almost spilling my coffee. "What? Yeah, fine." "Why?" He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You've been quiet lately." "I've just been stressed. You know, with the job search and all," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he turned his attention to Vanessa, who was flipping pancakes at the stove. "Vanessa, any plans for today?" She glanced over her shoulder with a smile. "Just errands. Maybe a little shopping. Jason could use some fresh air. Why don't you take him along?" I choked on my coffee. "I've got things to do," I said hurriedly. "Nonsense," Dad replied. "You've been cooped up in your room for days. Go out. It'll do you good." Vanessa smiled sweetly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement, maybe. "Sure. We can make a day of it." The car ride was tense. "I think he's on to us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa chuckled, her hands steady on the steering wheel. "Jason, relax. He's just trying to be a good father." "You don't understand," I insisted. "The way he looks at me, it's like he knows." She sighed, glancing at me briefly. "If he knew, he wouldn't be this calm. Trust me." Her confidence didn't soothe me. If anything, it made me more nervous. The shopping trip was uneventful, but the anxiety lingered. By the time we got home, I was mentally exhausted. Dad was in the living room, sipping a glass of whiskey and watching some crime drama. His gaze flicked to us as we walked in. "Have fun?" he asked, his tone casual. "Loads," Vanessa replied, holding up her shopping bags. "Jason was a big help." I forced a laugh, my throat dry. "Yeah, I'm gonna head up to my room." "Hold on," Dad said, his voice stopping me mid-step. "Sit down for a second. Both of you." My heart slammed against my ribs. I sat stiffly on the edge of the couch while Vanessa sank gracefully into the armchair. Dad swirled his whiskey, watching me with a calculating expression. "You've been acting different lately, Jason. Distracted. Nervous." I swallowed hard, struggling to keep my composure. "Like I said, it's just stress." He said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Stress." Vanessa jumped in smoothly. "Robert, you're making him sound like a suspect on one of your crime shows. The poor kid's just trying to get his life together." Her defense should have eased the tension, but it didn't. If anything, it seemed to deepen Dad's suspicion. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting between the two of us. You're right. I'm probably overthinking things. But the way he said it sent chills down my spine. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window made my nerves jangle. I kept imagining Dad bursting into my room, dragging me out of bed, demanding answers. When my phone buzzed with a text, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Vanessa, asterisk you're overthinking this. Me, asterisk I'm telling you he knows. Vanessa, asterisk he doesn't. Stop worrying. Her calmness felt like gaslighting. How could she be so sure? The next few days were unbearable. Dad's subtle observations turned into overt questioning. Where were you yesterday afternoon? He asked one evening as I was grabbing a soda from the fridge. I froze, gripping the can tightly. Out. Just driving around. Alone. Yes, I said too quickly. He nodded slowly, his gaze piercing. Interesting. What's interesting? I snapped, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Nothing, he said, his tone infuriatingly calm. I stormed out of the kitchen, feeling his eyes boring into my back. The breaking point came when one of Dad's friends stopped by for dinner. It was a casual visit, just a couple of steaks on the grill and a few beers. But halfway through the meal, his friend, Jack, made an offhand comment that sent my heart racing. You've got a real charmer here, Jack said, nodding toward Vanessa. She and Jason seemed to get along well. The table fell silent. Dad's expression hardened, his eyes flicking to Vanessa, then to me. Yeah, he said slowly. They do, don't they? Vanessa laughed, brushing off the comment. Oh, Jack, don't be ridiculous. Jason's like a little brother to me. The words felt like a slap, but they seemed to ease the tension. Dad forced a smile and the conversation moved on. But later that night, when I passed by Dad's office, I heard him on the phone. Something's not right, he was saying, his voice low. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to find out. The tension in the house became unbearable. Dad's growing suspicion loomed over everything, like a storm cloud ready to burst. I couldn't look him in the eye without feeling like he was dissecting me, peeling back layers until he found what he was looking for. Vanessa, of course, acted like everything was fine. She had this unshakable confidence that Dad wouldn't figure it out, and maybe she was right. Maybe I was just paranoid. But paranoia didn't explain the way Dad's gaze lingered on me during dinner or the pointed questions he kept throwing my way. I knew it was only a matter of time before he put the pieces together. The discovery came sooner than I expected. It started with Vanessa's phone. I didn't see it happen, but later she told me how she'd accidentally left it on the kitchen counter while she ran upstairs to grab something. Dad apparently was standing nearby. He claimed he'd heard it buzzing with a notification and, out of curiosity, glanced at the screen. That's when he saw my name. And the message. When I came home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. I walked into the living room, expecting to find Vanessa curled up with a book or scrolling through her phone. But she wasn't there. Vanessa, I called, my voice echoing slightly. No answer. I headed toward the kitchen, and that's when I heard it. The low, measured tone of Dad's voice. You're lying, he said. My stomach dropped. I crept closer, the words becoming clearer with each step. I'm not lying, Vanessa said, her voice strained but steady. Then explain the texts, Dad demanded. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. What texts? Vanessa asked, her voice defensive. Don't play dumb, Dad snapped. The ones from Jason. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Vanessa hesitated, and in that pause, I felt the walls closing in. Robert, I can explain. Explain what? He roared, his calm facade shattering. That you've been screwing my son behind my back? The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He knew. I didn't think, I just acted. Bursting into the kitchen, I found them standing face to face. Dad's expression a mix of rage and betrayal, Vanessa's pale and wide-eyed. Jason, Dad said, his voice cold and sharp. Perfect timing. Care to explain this? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What could I say? That it was a mistake? That I was sorry? None of it would fix this. You don't need to explain, Vanessa said quickly, stepping between us. This is my fault. Damn right it's your fault, Dad spat. But he's not innocent either. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. How could you do this to me? To your own father? I didn't mean for it to happen, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Oh, you didn't mean for it to happen? Dad shot back. What, you just tripped and fell into my wife's bed? That's enough, Robert, Vanessa said, her tone firm. No, he said, his voice rising. It's not enough. I want to hear it from him. I want to know why my son would betray me like this. I looked at him, at the hurt and fury etched into his face, and felt a wave of shame so overwhelming it was hard to breathe. I don't know, I admitted. I wasn't thinking. It just happened. Dad laughed, but it was bitter and hollow. It just happened. That's your excuse. Robert, please, Vanessa said, reaching for his arm. He jerked away from her. Don't touch me. She flinched, but her expression hardened. You're not exactly innocent in this, you know. You've been so busy with work. You barely noticed I was even here. Oh, so this is my fault now, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm just saying, she began, but he cut her off. Save it, he said coldly. I don't want to hear your excuses. Either of you. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Dad spoke, his voice low but firm. Pack your things, he said, looking directly at me. What? I asked, not sure I'd heard him correctly. You heard me, he said. Both of you, get out of my house. Robert, let's not do anything rash, Vanessa said, her voice calm but tinged with panic. Rash? He said, his eyes narrowing. You think this is rash? You're lucky I don't throw you out right now. I looked at Vanessa, hoping she'd have some kind of plan, but she just stood there, her composure cracking. Dad, please, I said. I know I screwed up. But nothing, he snapped. You made your choice, Jason. Now live with the consequences. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. That night, I packed my bags in a daze. Vanessa did the same, her movements mechanical. We didn't talk much, both too consumed by the weight of what had just happened. As I carried my suitcase down the stairs, I saw Dad standing in the doorway of his office, watching me with an expression that was equal parts anger and heartbreak. Goodbye, Jason, he said quietly, and for the first time, I realized just how much I'd lost. The night air felt heavy as I stood on the front porch, suitcase in hand. Vanessa was right behind me, her expression unreadable. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the faint warmth of the house I'd called home. We stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. I glanced at Vanessa, half expecting her to say something, but she just stared out at the dark street ahead. Where do we go now? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lit a cigarette, something I'd never seen her do before, and took a long drag. We figure it out, she said simply, exhaling a plume of smoke. The first night was a disaster. We ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the walls were paper thin and the carpet looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 80s. Vanessa paid in cash, and the guy behind the counter didn't even bother asking for ID. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the flickering neon sign outside cast an eerie glow through the window. This is cozy, I said, trying to lighten the mood. Vanessa didn't laugh. She just sank onto the edge of the bed and buried her face in her hands. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would all be okay, but the words felt hollow. I didn't even believe them myself. The days that followed were a blur. We moved from one motel to the next, dipping into her savings to cover the costs. I tried to find work, anything to keep us afloat, but my resume wasn't exactly inspiring, and I wasn't in the best state of mind for interviews. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed to adapt quickly. She started talking about finding a job herself, maybe as a receptionist or a sales associate. It's not like I have many options, she said one night. her tone bitter. I didn't know how to respond to that. Our relationship changed, too. In the house, our affair had felt like a secret thrill, something forbidden and intoxicating. Out here, in the real world, it felt more like a burden. The weight of what we'd done, what we'd lost, hung over us like a dark cloud. We fought more often now. Little arguments that spiraled into full-blown shouting matches. "I left everything for you," Vanessa yelled one night, her voice echoing off the motel walls. "I didn't ask you to," I shot back. "You think this is easy for me? I lost my dad because of you." "Because of me?" she repeated, her eyes blazing. "You're the one who couldn't keep your hands to yourself." I flinched at her words, the sting of them sharper than I'd expected. She must have noticed, because her expression softened. "Jason, I didn't mean." "Save it," I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. I spent that night driving aimlessly, my mind racing. I thought about calling Dad, about begging for his forgiveness, but I knew it was pointless. He'd made it clear that I wasn't welcome in his life anymore. When I finally returned to the motel, Vanessa was asleep, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the TV. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her. She looked so peaceful, so different from the woman who'd just torn into me hours earlier. I wondered if I still loved her, if I ever really had. The weeks turned into months. Vanessa found a job at a small boutique, and I eventually landed a gig at a hardware store. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills barely. We rented a tiny apartment downtown, the kind of place where the heater only worked half the time and the neighbors fought loudly at all hours. It was a far cry from the life we'd known in Dad's house. The cracks in our relationship only deepened. We'd gone from lovers to roommates, our conversations limited to the bare essentials. "Did you pay the electric bill?" "No, I thought you did." "I'll take care of it tomorrow." "Fine." One night, I came home late from work to find Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, her expression weary. "We can't keep doing this," she said softly. I dropped my bag on the floor and sighed. "Doing what?" "This," she said, gesturing around the room. "Living like this. Pretending like we're okay." I didn't know what to say. She was right. We weren't okay. "I'm sorry," I said finally, my voice cracking. "For what?" she asked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "For everything," I said. "For ruining your life. For ruining his." She shook her head. "We both made choices, Jason. This isn't just on you." That night, for the first time in months, we talked. Really talked. About what had happened, about the mistakes we'd made, about the people we'd hurt. It didn't fix anything, but it felt like a step toward something, closure, maybe. Meanwhile, Dad didn't reach out. I'd expected him to, at least to yell at me one last time, but the silence was deafening. It was as if I'd never existed. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he'd filed for divorce, that Vanessa's betrayal had been the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. I wondered if he blamed himself for any of it, or if he placed all the blame squarely on us. One night, I sat on the fire escape outside our apartment, staring at the city lights and thinking about everything I'd lost. Vanessa joined me, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. "Do you think we'll ever get past this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they weren't. They felt like a reminder of just how far we'd fallen, and how much further we had to go. The months dragged on, turning into a year. By then, Vanessa and I had settled into a rhythm, though it was far from harmonious. Life had become a series of compromises and unspoken grievances, a fragile truce held together by necessity rather than love. We were surviving, but just barely. I started working longer hours at the hardware store, partly to make ends meet and partly to avoid going home. The apartment had become a prison of sorts, its walls closing in on me every time Vanessa and I fought, which was often. "I can't do this anymore," I said one night after another shouting match about something stupid. I don't even remember what it was: money, dishes, the usual crap couples argue about. Vanessa glared at me from across the room, her eyes red and puffy. You think I can? I didn't say that, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. She laughed bitterly. Face it, Jason. We ruined our lives for nothing. Her words stung not because they were harsh but because they were true. Things only got worse after that. The apartment felt colder, emptier. We stopped talking except when absolutely necessary, the silence between us stretching like a canyon. One night, I came home to find Vanessa packing her bags. Where are you going? I asked, my voice hollow. She didn't look at me. I can't stay here anymore. Vanessa. I'm serious, Jason, she said, cutting me off. Whatever this is, it's not working. It never was. I felt a surge of panic, but I didn't know what to say to stop her. Deep down, I knew she was right. When did you decide this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She paused, her hands trembling as she folded a sweater. A long time ago. The next morning, she was gone. I stood in the empty apartment, staring at the spot where her suitcases had been, and felt an odd mix of relief and despair. For the first time in over a year, I was alone. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, going through the motions of work and sleep without really living. The apartment was too quiet now, its emptiness a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. One day, out of sheer desperation, I picked up the phone and called Dad. The line rang several times before he answered. Hello. His voice was calm but distant, as if he were speaking to a stranger. Dad, it's me, I said, my throat tightening. There was a long pause. What do you want, Jason? I wanted to talk, I said, stumbling over my words. About what? About everything. About us. Another pause. Then, there's nothing to talk about. Dad, please, I said, my voice cracking. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I can't. You made your choice, he interrupted, his tone cold. Now live with it. The line went dead. That conversation replayed in my head for days, each word cutting deeper than the last. I'd known he wouldn't forgive me. Not yet, maybe not ever, but hearing it still felt like a knife to the chest. Time passed and life went on. I eventually moved out of the apartment and into a smaller place closer to work. I cut ties with Vanessa completely, though I occasionally heard about her through mutual acquaintances. She'd moved out of town, started over somewhere new. Good for her, I thought bitterly. Dad and I never spoke again. I sent him a letter once, pouring out everything I couldn't say over the phone. How sorry I was, how much I regretted what I'd done. He never replied. Looking back, I don't know what I was expecting. Redemption? Closure? Maybe. But life doesn't work like that. Some mistakes can't be undone. Some wounds never heal. All you can do is keep moving forward, even if you're not sure where you're going. The final image I have of Dad is from a photograph someone showed me years later. He was smiling, standing next to a woman I didn't recognize, his arm around her waist. He looked happy. I guess that's all I ever wanted for him. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. The guilt hasn't gone away, but it's dulled over time, like an old scar. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, but maybe that's the point.